Hey, everybody. Welcome to the inaugural episode of Unlocking Your Truth. My name is Franchesca Stoyer, and I want to thank you so very much for joining me. So I think a good place to start with this podcast is to talk about what it means to be your true self. I have a lot of thoughts and ideas on what I think it means. And if you're watching on YouTube and you have some thoughts on what you think it means, I would love for you to drop it in the comments and open this discussion up. That would be amazing. But before we talk about what I think it means to be your true self, I want to share a quote with you that I heard several years back that I feel perfectly encompasses the feeling that comes with being your true self. And so now this quote came from a meditation from Sarah Blondin. She's on Insight Timer. She's awesome. But the meditation that I was listening to that had this particular quote is called, "I would like to give you permission." And I want to share this quote with you because this really hit me deep in regards to the feeling that comes with being your true self. "I would like to give you permission to come out from hiding and be here, unapologetically you. Let this be a reunion with the you sometimes don't allow yourself to be, and the you are sometimes afraid to be. If you do not know who this you is, it is the one inside of you that feels relief when it comes home and closes the door." Now, I don't know if that hits you all the same way it hit me when I first heard it, but that hit me deep because being an introvert by nature, I totally jive with that feeling of coming home and closing the door and the feeling of release that comes with that. I tend to get pretty anxious in social situations. And I also would compartmentalize myself in little boxes depending on who I was hanging out with at that time, because there were many parts of myself that I did not allow myself to be. There were many parts of myself that I was afraid to be, depending on who I was hanging out with. And it was quite exhausting. It was quite taxing. It didn't feel good. And it made me quite unhappy, to be quite honest with you. And as I started to become aware that this is what I was doing, I asked myself the question, well, don't I why don't I allow myself to be my true self more often? And this will be a good segue to actually talk about what I feel it means to be your true self, because this might offer some indication as to why I didn't feel like I was giving myself permission to do so. And a lot of it comes down to safety. And that's going to be a common thread that you're going to hear throughout this episode and probably throughout this entire podcast. But what I personally feel it means to be your true self is feeling safe to express your emotions and your needs, feeling safe to be vulnerable, feeling safe to speak up for yourself in a compassionate way when you feel it's necessary to speak up for yourself, to acknowledge responsibility and hold yourself accountable when you make a mistake, knowing that it doesn't define you as a person. That's just a few of the top things at the top of my mind of what I feel it means to be your true self. And when I think about those things, I also think that I can't possibly be the only person who maybe doesn't feel safe doing these things, because that's what it came down to for me. That was the answer to the question when I said, why don't I allow myself to be my true self more often? It's because I didn't feel safe doing any of that. I didn't feel safe expressing my needs and emotions. I didn't feel safe being vulnerable. I didn't feel safe speaking up for myself. I didn't feel safe holding myself accountable. And a lot of other things I didn't feel safe doing. And I'm like, I can't possibly be the only one who doesn't feel safe doing these things, and I'll tell you a pretty good indicator in me thinking or me feeling like I'm not the only one is the problems that we are currently having on a macro level in our society. I truly, honestly think that most of our problems are as a result of us not feeling safe to live our truth. And when I say that, I want to be really clear that I'm not talking about arrogance here. Arrogance is not living your truth. It's actually a fear-based response, and I'll get into that deeper in a future episode. But that is not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is feeling safe to do all of those things that I mentioned. And when I think about those problems and what I feel as a result of those problems, I started to wonder, well, what if everyone did feel safe to do those things? You know, like what if everyone felt safe to express their needs and emotions, to be vulnerable, to speak up for themselves, to hold themselves accountable? Like how that might look different in our society. How might that change our relation to one another, not only on a micro level, but on a macro level? You know, like what would that look like if we all felt safe to do all those things, right? And so going back to me not feeling safe to do those things and starting to dig a little deeper in why I didn't feel safe doing all those things. And, you know, I really, really credit not only my yoga practice, but also the work of many leaders in the field of trauma, because I had the honor and the privilege of studying the work of many of these people. And I actually had the honor of learning from some of them directly to be able to go to that next deeper level as to why I wasn't feeling safe doing these things in my adult life. And a lot of it came from my upbringing. And, you know, my upbringing wasn't necessarily unique, you know, because I feel like the things that occurred that caused me to not feel safe to do these things in my adult life were more of like a generational thing. You know what I mean? Like, I'll give you a perfect example. Actually, before I get into the examples, I also want to note, because I think it's really important to note this, is how these things affected me doesn't necessarily mean that it was going to affect someone else in the same exact way. Okay. So like my experience and how I internalized these things that caused this lack of safety within me in my adult life, it hits people different depending on how they internalize it, how they cope with it, you know, so I just want to get real clear on that. Okay. And there's no right or wrong to it. It's just, we take it in and we internalize it based upon our uniqueness to ourselves. So I guess that in and of itself makes it unique, because the way I internalize it may be relatively unique, or maybe it's the same as somebody else. You know, it really just all depends upon the person. But going back to the examples, I feel like my upbringing was based or revolved around a fear-based household. So like, for example, if you do this, then that will happen. So like if I fell out of line or misbehaved or made a mistake at all, then there was a consequence as a result. There was also, I remember there not being a whole lot of praise, you know, either. I remember there not being a whole lot of accountability on when it came to the adults. It was kind of like that mentality of, you know, the adult knows better no matter what. And there was also a level of volatility that, like, where it's like I didn't know when the other shoe was going to drop, you know, and that caused me in my adult life, and even as I was growing up, it caused me to be hyper vigilant. And like I felt like my sympathetic nervous system, my fight or flight response, was like on the vast majority of the time. You know, like I felt like I was constantly scanning for threats. Also, you know, it was what I say goes, you know, with zero opportunity for dialogue in regards to that. So I kind of felt like My opinion didn't matter. I didn't feel heard. I didn't feel I had a voice. I didn't have a right to speak up for myself. Because even then, speaking up or talking back, as that generation might rephrase it, was there was a consequence to that. There was lack of boundaries. I was expected to stop everything I was doing at the drop of a hat if somebody else needed something, regardless of what was going on with me. There was the old phrase, stop crying or I'll give you something to cry about. That was another one. So, I that didn't offer the opportunity for me to express my emotions in a healthy way. It didn't offer me the opportunity to be vulnerable until my system became so flooded and overwhelmed with emotion because I wasn't able to express it, that I would totally blow up and lose my cool. So it caused me to become reactive. So many of these things from my upbringing spilled into my adult life and how I navigated the world and how I navigated my relationships, including the relationship with myself, like because I didn't have a voice when I was younger, interrupting me is like a huge trigger for me. Huge. Like, meaning like I will go from 0 to 1,000 in a millisecond if somebody interrupts me. It's taken a lot of practice to dial that down. But I would lose it. I would lose it when someone would interrupt me because someone was taking my voice away from me yet again. So that was one thing. I had a tendency to people please and, not rock the boat in relationships. But then on the other end of that spectrum, I held resentment and anger because of that people pleasing and rocking the boat, because I felt like I didn't have the right to attend to my needs or express my needs. I'd also sometimes go the route of non-expression altogether because I was terrified of confrontation. So it was just easier for me to shut people out. And there would also be moments that I would shut people out because I couldn't trust my emotions and that I wouldn't get reactive in those situations. So it was just easier for me to just shut my mouth and just shut someone out. So that's just a few examples of how, stuff that happened in my upbringing translated into my adult life and my adult relationships. And as I've just discussed that, I just want to get super, super, super clear about something. This is not a blame thing. I'm not blaming anyone here. Okay. And before I say this, I also want to acknowledge, okay, that I understand, given the opportunity to look through a trauma-informed lens when it comes to this, I try my very, very best to look through that lens as often as possible and respect that. So I just want to acknowledge that for sure there is exceptions to this. And there is a ton of nuance in regards to what I'm about to say. But more often than not, I believe our parents did not mean to hurt us, but they still did. Our parents just, they just did the best they could with what they knew, like I feel like that they didn't know, they either weren't aware of what they were doing when they were doing it, or or maybe it's both, or they just didn't know that another way was possible. Like they were not aware that there was another way that was possible. So I just think it's really important to mention and clarify that there's no blame happening here whatsoever. But getting back to the conversation and getting back to, thinking about what if there was another way. Like our parents didn't know and they didn't think that another way was possible. Well, what if another way is possible? What if what if we lived in a world where we can do all of those things I mentioned, that we felt safe to, express our emotions and our needs, that we felt safe to speak up for ourselves, that we felt safe to hold ourselves accountable without shame. Like, what kind of world would that be? And would it even be possible? Would it even be possible to do? Now, you would call me an idealist. I personally would not call myself that, because I typically have the propensity to jump to the worst case scenario right out the gate. So an idealist would not be something I would call myself, which is called negative bias, by the way. Jumping to worst case scenario is negative bias. It's actually a thing. Our brains are actually hardwired for it. Again, I'll get into that in a future episode on a deeper level, but just note that. But I do truly believe in my heart of hearts that not only is it possible, but that our world would be a much better place as a result of it if we were able to feel safe doing all those things. Now, does that mean that there are going to be actions without consequences? Of course not. Of course not. We have to look at this in a realistic way. We have to understand that if we contribute to the hurt of somebody else, there's going to be a consequence to that, 100%. Okay. What I'm talking about is how we navigate our relationships, again, not only on a micro level, but on a macro level as well, and incorporating all those things like vulnerability, compassion, kindness, accountability, responsibility, reciprocity, in order to improve our relationships, in order to repair our relationships, not only with ourselves, not only with those closest to us, but on a societal level as well. What would that look like? What would that look like if we were able to bring more safety into being our true self? I think it would look like a pretty good place to be. Now, you might be asking yourself, who the hell is this lady? What the hell does she know? And totally valid question. Aside from the fact that I've been working on this not only personally, but with other people for close to a decade. And I've worked with a lot of wonderful people to help me get a better understanding of this. I am someone who personally, for most of my life, up until about 10 years ago, when I started doing this work, that I thought that none of what I just said was possible was. I didn't think it was possible. After years of low self-worth, unhealthy relationships, unhealthy habits to numb and suppress the feelings of discontent that came with all of that, I came to a point of desperation and hopelessness that basically I had no other choice but to search for another choice, for another way that was possible, that I did not think was possible prior to me getting to that point. And when I started searching for that other way, I was starting to search for more healthy ways to, for lack of a better phrase, cope with my discontent. I went the route of, meditation and, I like reading, doing things to relax, healthier things to relax than what I was used to. And it eventually led me to my first yoga practice with a DVD and a beach towel as a mat in the middle of my living room. And I'm so, so, so grateful for that day, although I didn't realize it at the time. But that day was the catalyst for where I am right now, because it was the yoga practice. And I don't just mean the yoga practice of the poses that you do on your mat, that kind of stuff. I'm talking about the philosophy of yoga. I'm talking about the practice that we do off the mat. it led me to a point of self-study, which is also called svadhyaya in our yoga practice. A point of self-study and self-reflection that facilitated my desire to not only know what it was that I did that caused such discontent, but why I did it to begin with. And it was exploring and having a better understanding of that why that literally transformed my life. Because I feel like without the why, it was impossible for me to incorporate how to change it. And I'll give you a perfect example of this. Let's say your car starts making a weird sound. You have no idea what it is. If you don't know why your car is making that noise, then how do you know how to fix it? The same thing applies for us. If we don't know why we're doing something, then how can we know how to fix it on a long-term level, at least? Sure, there are band-aids. There are ways that we can do quick fixes. They never stay fixed, though. It always comes back at some point. But if we want that long-term transformation, if we want that long-term shift, that why is instrumental in that. And that why led me to other healing modalities. It led me to the wonderful people in the field of trauma that I had the honor of, studying their work and learning from them directly. And again, that work transformed me even more in ways that I never thought was possible 10 years ago. Like, I never thought it was possible. And it helped me to better understand that change truly does start from within. It just, at least for my experience, it truly does start within. And when I started to transform within myself, I noticed the difference, not only within myself, but with how I navigated with my relationships. I noticed the health of my relationships shifting. And I also noticed the shift in how I related to people in general and how I viewed the world. And it also helped me to get to the other side of all of this stuff that was holding me back versus keeping me stuck, so I could actually thrive in my life and thrive by being myself and embodying my true self, more importantly. And I believe that if I could do it, that you can do it too. And I think that every person has the capacity to learn to get to know themselves better. I believe that everybody has the capacity to have a better relationships with themselves. I believe that everybody who can be more at peace with themselves, that those feelings will eventually radiate out to relationships with other people on a micro and macro level. And thinking about that, thinking about the potential ripple effect and how far reaching the effects of that ripple effect can be if we all were able to create that shift and transform to feel safer in being our true self. Like, that right there, thinking of that potential and that possibility, that is what makes me so passionate and committed to doing this work. Talking about it right now, I'm getting goosebumps. And it is the fuel. It is the spark that gets me wanting to share this with as many people as possible who will, who is willing to listen, who is willing to put in this work, you know, that is what fuels me, that potential. And I truly believe that that potential is there. You know, it's going to take work. It's going to take time, but I do think it's possible. And I do think that we are all capable of doing it. I truly believe that. And, you know, really, that's pretty much where I am with this whole concept of being true self. And quite honestly, this is not where it ends. Obviously, this is just the beginning, which is why I started a podcast, which is why I'm sharing through blogs, through my social media, through my coaching, through my workshops and events, and all the things that I'm doing. Like, this is just the beginning. And we're going to get into this a lot more and on a deeper level here. And, you know, I just want to thank you all for joining me on this ride, and thank you all for listening. And I'm really just so looking forward to us unlocking our truth together. Hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your day. See you next time.